Hello, everyone. Today we're joined by Noah Buxton, who works for the blockchain practice Armanino and also is involved with the Digital Chamber of Commerce. Please, can you give a brief introduction, Noah?
Hey, Ian, thanks for having me. Pleasure to be here with you on Coinscrum. Quick introduction personally. I'm a reformed attorney with a background in risk assurance and audit, as well as technology. And, the firm I work for, Armanino, we're a top 20 public accounting firm based in the US. We work globally. We've got about 1,500 employees. And I was drawn into this crypto space in about 2016, really through a client engagement. So that was an interesting way to get in, but I got pulled down the rabbit hole very quickly. And today, I'm co-founder of our digital assets and blockchain practice and leader of that industry group at the firm. And I get to put my passion to work in a few different ways each day, but really it's building innovative new solutions that are, we think, world first for public accounting, but also world first and important for the digital asset industry.
Okay, Noah, so we know you co-authored a recent report for the Chamber called Proof of Reserves, the practitioner's guide to an emerging standard for increasing trust and transparency in digital asset platform services. Could you tell us a little bit about the background to this great initiative, who contributed to the outputs, and what do you hope it's going to be useful?
Yeah, absolutely. So first off, the Chamber of Digital Commerce is an advocacy group, mostly DC centric and working on US policy issues and digital assets at crypto. And I think absolutely, one of the best. I've been working with the Digital Chamber in their working groups and been a participating member, and my team has for a couple of years now. And frankly, the talent there, I learned something on every call, right? So the talent there is pretty impressive, from other folks in public accounting to regulatory attorneys, as well as a lot of voices from industry, some of the largest names in the space. So great organization and a lot of good information sharing. And that sort of, starts the background of how we got involved in this initiative and how we initially published this paper. So in May of 2020, Armanino performed what we thought was a very novel and a pretty powerful implementation of this proof of reserves idea. We did that for a large exchange called Gate.io. They're, I think, depending on the day, 12 or 15 in rank globally by their daily volumes. And a few of us at the Chamber, these people become friends pretty quickly. We've been talking about these issues. And so what are the implications of proof of reserves? How could it be bigger? How could it be more standardized? And so we're keen to work with friends in the industry and really advance what we think is a really promising area, an important area for this industry. So, frankly, I probably drank too much coffee one weekend. I hammered out sort of a skeleton of what this paper could look like. Because of that, the gracious folks at the Chamber let me hold the conch shell during a few of the meetings. And, but really it's a story of a really good collaborative story. A number of key participants. I think we had good participation from, as I said, experts of the industry, regulatory attorneys, public accounting. We got historical and sort of monetary theory perspective from Nick Carter. We got commodities exchange perspective from industry, ARSX and others. Other accounting firms like Cohen Company, KPMG, Deloitte, some of the larger names in the world. As well as even commodity sort of opinions from Coin RegTech. A lot of great participation.
Thanks, Noah. And so let's talk about, from a technological standpoint, the concept, and in a handful of cases, the implementation has been around for many years already. And at a high level, perhaps explain what the concept of proof of reserves is for digital exchanges and custodians, where there is a need for perhaps more concise definitions and taxonomies and standard setting. How does the concept sort of work at a technical level?
Sure, happy to. So I guess, you could say, as long as humans in society have been trusting each other with store of value in one way or another, there's been some need for assurance. The accounting industry is a very old one because of that. In its most essential form, proof of reserves is really a way to close a trust gap that's created by a centralized third party when they're holding your assets. And in this case, proof of reserves is really directed at digital assets. And so it's really all about closing the trust gap of when you, as say a consumer or maybe an institutional player, trust a third party custodian or exchange to hold your keys for you, hold your Bitcoins for you. And I guess you could say the unwritten promise here has been a one-to-one reserve. So, 1 Bitcoin liability on the platform, on your exchange account, for instance, should be backed by a 1 Bitcoin reserve held by the exchange or the custodian. And I think that that's been the unwritten promise because, these unique digital assets have over time gained a character of sort of a character of a commodity, right? And I think they're treated and thought of that way by their owners. And so, depositing a Bitcoin to an exchange feels much more like, handing over the keys to your car to the valet more than it does, sort of putting $1 in the bank account where we all sort of know, we're trusting this, large institution and network, but ultimately that a lot of that is loaned out on the backside. So I think that's sort of some of the underlying genesis for why this idea or this practice is needed. Mm-hmm. I think you started to ask about, I think why this is needed now, and I'm happy to speak to that. Mm-hmm. I think, there's been a lot happening in the industry. Obviously, things move very, very quickly, but I think the market is already speaking. So, I think I could say CoinFloor is an early leader in proof of reserves. They've been doing it since 2014, and that was actually around the time that an early Bitcoin developer, Greg Maxwell, even theorized that we should, be able to check or put a check on he said, quote unquote, evil exchange, right? That they should be able to prove to us that they're properly custodying and holding enough of our Bitcoins to back the liabilities that they have to customers. So, you already have certain industry players trying to go forward and offer this level of transparency. You've got an interesting public conversation or industry conversation that's sprouted up around centralized or fiat-backed centralized stablecoins, right? Are the dollars in the bank account? Are they adequately collateralized stablecoins? And these are POR or proof of reserves like questions. You've got the flourishing of crypto lending, both centralized and decentralized, but in the centralized case, there's a lot of eyebrows being raised around these platforms, right? Are these trustable platforms? Should we be placing our trust in these companies? Are they adequately regulated? And if they're managing a loan book, there's significantly more risk around the way that they're managing assets, right? There's significantly more risk of default, specifically on the customer liability, on the Bitcoin that you've deposited to those platforms. So there's a lot, I think, of interest there around proof of reserves. And then you also have some of these novel things happening. I think Celsius said that they're going to register their assets on another blockchain and called that a proof of reserves. I'm not sure that's a proof of reserves exactly, but the interest is there, right? To show and demonstrate to customers, hey, we've got the Bitcoins. Chainlink, leading Oracle network, mostly on Ethereum now, is publishing proof of reserves information or collateral balance information back on chain for use by smart contracts. So all of this stuff is swirling, and also regulation is already moving. Wyoming, a state in the U.S., and their special depository banking law has enshrined proof of reserves as a requirement. Canada actually has just Canada's SEC has essentially said in their guidance that proof of reserves is a very relevant procedure or offer of proof, for a regulated entity. And even I think it's Hong Kong's regulations also speak to proof of reserves. Japan's FSA has spoken to proof of reserves for many years, excuse me. And so this stuff is moving, and this is the right time, I think, for experts in the industry to sort of, come forward with all of the things that they know and better educate the industry and the regulators on what the right approach is.
Yeah, you touched on some of the new products that are being offered on exchanges, and so interest-bearing offerings really do then ask the question as to what's happening with collateral rehypothecation, and how do I know if I want to get my coin back, I'm going to be able to get it back straight away. You know, where is it? And that speaks to the liquidity and the ease to remove one's asset from an exchange. All right, so let's move on to the paper itself, which talks about a three-pronged approach and a collateralized crypto claim framework. Can you walk us through this model and perhaps speak, and you touched on stable coins before, but go into a bit more detail around the type of tokens that you cover off, whether fiat-backed stablecoins or algo stablecoins, and what sort of DeFi tokens, whether it be LPs, etc.
Sure thing. So in this process, I think a number of us are sort of Bitcoiners, we could say. We're sort of Bitcoin first and believe in Bitcoin. And proof of reserves in its inception was a Bitcoin first or Bitcoin exchange focused idea. And so we wanted to bring that. We wanted to bring that to the professional world, to professional services and attorneys and to the industry in a really honest way around, like, here's the genesis idea. What can we do to make it better, to flesh it out, and make it more accessible and usable and standardized? Early on in that process, we realized, as I mentioned, there's all these things swirling, and the market is sort of saying what it wants proof of reserves to be, or participants are trying to offer this level of assurance to their consumers. And so pretty quickly we realized, okay, we have to take a little bit broader view here. We have to pull back, widen the aperture to say there are lots of trust gaps that feel like this, Bitcoin exchange trust gap. There are other trust gaps that feel very similar in digital assets, and actually a lot of the same basic principles apply. So shouldn't we be smart about this and say, let's build an umbrella so that the industry can see, hey, maybe this is, or maybe this is not the right answer, but let's let the market decide, but let's let them decide, hopefully within a reasonable framework. And so what we addressed in the digital chamber paper first is what we call platforms, or crypto platforms. So these are exchanges, custodians, derivatives venues, right? These are the classical: deposit your Bitcoin, do some activity, and withdraw your Bitcoin. Also lending operations. And so we extended the proof of reserves concepts to those players. Also, we don't address them in much detail in the paper, but we can here, which is, there are, as you said, stable coins, or what we call in the paper asset-backed tokens, and also crypto security instruments. So let me explain that real quick. Starting with the crypto collateralized claim. If you deposit a Bitcoin to an exchange and you hope to get that Bitcoin in return, at some point in the future, essentially the exchange has issued you a crypto collateralized claim, a Bitcoin collateralized claim. And if you hold a stable coin, you're essentially holding what we think is a crypto collateralized claim. It's really a dollar held in reserve, but and then on the other side of the sort of the spectrum, I guess you could say, you have a number of products that are being developed: tracker notes, exchange traded products, even crypto funds, where the issuer is issuing a crypto collateralized claim. So CoinShares is a good example, a company that we work closely with. They issue trackers or exchange traded notes, and those notes trade on NASDAQ exchanges, but they're backed up 1-to-1 or 100, fully collateralized by the underlying crypto price that they track. And so again, there's trust gaps in all of these, and it's really the idea of extending proof of reserves to each of these ideas in a meaningful way.
Whilst the level of transparency can be seen as a positive, especially as institutional adoption picks up, and likely that's something that can't be provided for within traditional financial services, let's talk a bit about privacy. And did you cover this off in your paper in terms of customers' data and how you're thinking about protecting the client's data on an exchange, for example?
Yeah, sure. We got into that a little bit, in the paper, and I think the highest level answer here is that proof of reserves implementations in the wild today, let's say CoinFloor again as an example, who does a self-published proof of reserves. It's sort of natively privacy preserving. They don't publish any information that deals with the underlying identifiable individual or customer. There's not those two pieces of information that can be combined to identify a natural person. And so in the methodologies that we discuss in this paper, also in sort of the special recipe, I think that Armanino has developed and is applying today in the market, we take that same approach, right? We're not, so to say, interested in the personal information of the underlying customers, nor do we want to expose it in any way. And so in these implementations, I think that, they're ultimately privacy preserving. There's some interesting work on the forefront too, even around zero knowledge proofs and how, those can actually be applied to be even, I guess, sort of more robustly privacy preserving. But today, let's say in the Armanino example, if you look at the Gate.io proof of reserves, it covered almost 3 million accounts. It was done using hashed user IDs. So we do perform procedures at the exchange to validate the list of liabilities that we're getting, but we do that in already a privacy preserving way. So we're looking for a complete and accurate export of non-zero Bitcoin balances or other crypto asset balances, but again, in a privacy preserved way to start.
It's good to know that you're considering data privacy as well. Okay, so let's talk about, as we see the maturity of the industry and the adoption, as I mentioned before, increases with large investors coming into the space. Mm-hmm. Why do you think it's important for the industry as a whole to start collaborating, as you guys have done at the Chamber, and adopting these standards? And what effort would be required on the part of the market participants to implement the recommendations that your paper proposes?
Yeah, so I think the quick answer is that self-regulatory measures here, in this case, are going to be better than a wait and see approach. And active engagement with regulators and education on what is possible is going to be a better approach. So personally, I believe that digital assets, cryptographic assets, are in many ways better assets. And I think that the type of assurance, the type of oversight that can be given is overall better. Now, I think that certainly comes with caveats. I'm not sure I would extend that personally, that same statement to say KYC necessarily. I think that there should not be disparate treatment. I think that that's an important thing we need to think about, right? Is that if you sort of, work globally, but of course, I think about the US probably more. And, I see disparate treatment with recent FinCEN moves, right? To treat digital assets and the movement of them, and specifically suspicious activity reporting, creates a disparate treatment. It creates a disparate result, as opposed to cash. I think that that's the wrong regulatory result. So, when it comes to proof of reserves, active engagement, or not even proof of reserves, when it comes to a regulator trying to protect markets and protect consumers, they should, be looking to the best, most focused way to do that without creating, again, a treatment that's disparate to other asset classes or other industry types. So you asked about effort too. So let me, I guess, take a step back and sort of maybe tease apart the concept in its sort of at a technical level, and that might help. So ultimately, the proof of reserves process for an exchange is probably a lot like, depending on the approach, it could be either a lot like an internal audit project or process that a company might go through, or it might be sort of like an external audit process. In its original concept, its original form, it was sort of two main ingredients for proof of reserves. And this again is back to the Greg Maxwell theory of proof of reserves. And this would be on the side more of an internal management produced sort of effort. It really involves publishing digital signatures for company wallets. And what does that mean? Well, it does mean that you would have to publish the public key of, say, the cold storage wallets or cold and hot wallets that together, are enough collateral asset to back liabilities. And then on the other side, the liability side, creating a cryptographic proof of the liability set, right? All the Bitcoin owed to, John Doe and Jane Smith each have 5 Bitcoin, etc. Now, that original recipe of 2 ingredients, again, not necessarily difficult for an exchange to produce that today. I think custody teams can do digital signatures, and accounting and operations teams can pull customer database information. Not an extremely heavy lift. And so, when you hear from exchanges that this is, borders on the impossible, I don't think that that's true. I think that, the larger the exchange, the more complex the organization gets. It can get more complex, but it's definitely very possible, especially for organizations that have the right level of internal control and process to begin with. The newer concept of proof of reserves, I would say, I think it kind of has 4 main ingredients, or at least the way Armanino is applying it, at least the way we've talked about it in the paper as possible, is 4 main ingredients. So you've got this liability side that I mentioned, the asset side, some form of attestation or attest reporting under a recognized standard of attest, and then a third-party hosted verifier tool. So teasing those apart a little bit, the liability side again is bringing traditional audit procedures to this process, right? Methodologies that have been trusted by publicly traded companies and markets for decades and decades, bringing those methodologies to the liability side of the equation, right? Can we get a complete and accurate export without cheats from the exchange? The asset side is at the highest level requesting digital signatures, and there are other wallet schemes and custody schemes that throw a wrench in that, but ultimately trying to get digital signatures. And this is good because the exchange can now show proof to the auditor without disclosing necessarily all of the cold storage addresses. And exchanges think that that's good for them, right? That's sort of confidentiality preserving and also, arguably security measure as well. Then there's this idea of attest reporting. Again, sort of it's bringing this traditional trusted frameworks and methodologies, peer review, licensor of the accounting firm, reputation of the accounting firm, bringing that to bear to provide a more transparent wrapper around this process. And lastly, this third-party hosted verifier tool. In the original implementation of proof of reserves, it's pretty cumbersome, actually. It's, to think about how a user would actually do it. My mom certainly wouldn't be doing it because she'd have to go to GitHub and download a couple of assets, a verifier code base, as well as the Merkleized set or the Merkle set of liabilities. And she'd have to run that code locally and then put in her balances and see if she could find her path to the root, right? I might have even lost some of the audience here, which I know is a pretty technical audience. So what this does, what we've published is an independent page that hosts this verifier. The user does not have to hold this complete cryptographic set, which is actually, again, good for the exchange, but they can easily participate in a web interface to see were they included in this proof of reserves process. And that's actually the magic of proof of reserves, is that the customer of the exchange can participate. They can actually get in there and say, as of this date, my balance was this, and here's my hashed user ID. Was I included?
Okay, well, let's flip it on its head and talk about some of the potential criticisms of proof of reserves, and that while it may prove that any given asset exists under the control of a centralized exchange or custodian, at any point in time that the client may validate them, as you just mentioned, nothing prevents those assets from being subsequently moved, right? So is this a perfect solution, or do risks still remain under these standards? And what role do you see third parties playing in this process?
It's a perfectly valid criticism. And, I don't think that proof of reserves or for platforms, the way we've articulated it, is necessarily a panacea. So yes, risks remain. And, if you're actually looking at the Gate.io proof of reserves attest report, you can see we have a whole section for that, just to actually clearly define in plain language, what are the remaining risks? What are the open areas that a consumer might want to consider here? And you also mentioned frequency. It's very important, right? In the simplest case, you could, Ian and I, you and I could collude, right, as an exchange operator, and I could run exchange, Noah's exchange, and you could run Ian's exchange, and we could be out in the market telling our customers that we're fully reserved, but we could be using each other, right, to stuff our balance sheet every time the auditor comes by, but then rehypothecate those assets or lend them out for interest, put them at risk on the backside. So it's perfectly valid criticism. So two things become important: frequency, doing this in a set cadence or relatively frequently becomes very important. And that's, I think, what we'll see emerge is that as the understanding goes up and the complexity goes down and the cost goes down of this, ultimately it'll become a more frequent and more baked in type of procedure. And also, I think in reality here, these exchanges are become more and more complex. They have other regulatory requirements. They have other external auditors and things, providing checks and balances. So the idea that these, funds are swept here and there is still very possible, but for the largest names in the world, becomes less and less possible.
Okay, let's move on to the next question and just talk a bit about how your proposals and the great piece that you've written has been received by the industry, and what additional work will the Chamber be doing to encourage wider adoption?
Yeah, so I think overall, pretty well received. I think people, number one, the level of complexity is appreciated. Unfortunately, some of the information produced in our industry is sometimes too generic. It sort of just hits the top of the waves. And so we really made an effort to go deep. And, later in the paper, there's even information that I think custodial teams, technical teams would find very valuable around the Merkelization of liabilities and even other opportunities for, technical options, I guess you could say, for proving reserves or doing privacy preserves digital signatures. So overall, well received. I think industry players are certainly worried about the cost of compliance. That's very relevant. It's a very, as putting your exchange business hat on, again, you're running Ian's exchange. Of course, you care about the cost of compliance and aren't looking for additional costs of compliance that don't necessarily move the needle for you. I think that's one interesting thing about proof of reserves is, unlike maybe say an IT audit requirement in a given jurisdiction, or a financial statement audit yearly requirement, or a capital reserves requirement, proof of reserves is a very market-facing, consumer-facing, consumer-engaged type activity. And so I think it actually is value add in a marketing way, in a consumer relationship way for the exchange. So if I had to be, proposing things that ultimately cause a financial cost to the exchange, and I think this is a pretty good one. I think that's kind of what we're hearing as well.
Yeah, you could argue that it will add a USP to any particular participant vis-a-vis the competition by having clear standardized proof of reserves. Okay, so let's wrap up. We will add the link to our show notes, but where can folks go and find out more regarding the proof of reserves work?
Sure, I definitely encourage them to visit the Chamber of Digital Commerce. Google that and proof of reserves, and you'll get right there to a landing page with some resources in the paper. Certainly, we're producing information here at Armanino, armaninOllp.com. And also, information on social. You can find me on LinkedIn. You can certainly find me on Twitter as well at BTCMePLZ, BTC me please. So looking forward to staying in touch and hopefully hearing a little bit from the audience around what they think of proof of reserves as well.
Well, thank you ever so much for joining us, Noah. All the best.
Thanks, Ian.